You've probably heard the term the Epstein Files thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean? So in this explainer, we're going to cut through all that noise to break down exactly what these documents are, where they came from, and why they still matter so much. And we're sticking strictly to what's in the public record.
So, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll get a clear definition. What are we even talking about here? Then we'll walk through a timeline just to get our bearings. After that, we'll dive in and decode what's really inside the documents, look at the huge legal controversies they kicked up, and finally, get a handle on the lasting impact of it all.
Okay, let's dive right in. First things first, what exactly are we talking about when we say the Epstein Files?
Right off the bat, this is absolutely crucial to understand. This isn't one single file or some secret binder. The Epstein Files is basically an informal catch-all term for a massive, sprawling collection of records. We're talking court documents, witness testimonies, financial data, flight logs, you name it, all connected to Jeffrey Epstein and his network.
Okay, but, these documents didn't just appear out of thin air. To really get what they mean, we have to understand the story behind them, and that's where the timeline of the case becomes so important.
So the whole story really kicks off back in 2005 with that first police investigation. That led to the incredibly controversial 2008 Non-Prosecution Agreement, the NPA. Then things were kind of quiet for a while until 2019, the year Epstein was arrested on federal charges and then later died in custody. And finally, in 2021, his associate Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted, which really confirmed the existence of this whole trafficking network. And here's the key part. Every single one of these events created a mountain of paperwork.
All right, so now that we have the timeline down, let's start peeling back the layers. What's actually inside these files? What are the main types of documents we're dealing with?
First up, we've got to talk about the one category that probably gets the most attention, those infamous flight logs.
So what are these exactly? Well, they were basically the pilot's own records, logging who was on board Epstein's private jets for various flights. And yes, they did mention a number of high-profile people from politics, business, and academia. For investigators, this was gold. It was a way to connect the dots, to establish patterns of who was associating with whom, and to track travel.
Okay, I'm going to pause here for a second because this next point is probably the single most important thing to remember in all of this. Just because someone's name appears in a document, it does not mean they are guilty of a crime. The courts have warned about this over and over again. These are often just raw legal filings, not proven facts. Association is not the same as an accusation, and it is definitely not a conviction.
All right, moving on to the next category, and these are, arguably the most powerful and difficult documents in the entire collection, the sworn depositions from victims.
This is really where we get a look at the how. How did this whole operation work? In these sworn testimonies, victims laid out, in their own words, the disturbing recruitment methods, often starting with the pretense of a massage. They detailed the specific roles that Epstein's associates played, and critically, they described this systematic, peer-to-peer recruitment where victims themselves were manipulated into bringing others into the fold.
And that brings us to our third major bucket of documents, which is all about following the money. And, of course, the massive legal paper trail.
So investigators dug into these records to trace where the money was going, and it was a real mess. A complex web of offshore accounts, trusts, you name it. And get this, a huge chunk of the files we're talking about today actually got unsealed because of a separate defamation lawsuit between Virginia Giuffre and Ghislaine Maxwell. That case gave us a treasure trove of emails and communications that became another critical layer of evidence.
You see, these files didn't just expose potential crimes. Their release and everything inside them kicked off these huge legal and ethical debates that, honestly, are still raging today. At the heart of it all, there were really two massive legal firestorms. On the one hand, you have that 2008 plea deal. It was a non-prosecution agreement that basically gave immunity to Epstein and a bunch of unnamed co-conspirators. It raised all these questions about how much power prosecutors should have. Then, on the other hand, you have the issue of victims' rights. A federal court actually found later that the secret way that deal was negotiated broke the law because the victims were never told about it.
So, that leads to the big question, right? Why are we still talking about this case? What's its lasting impact on the legal system?
Well, the fallout has been absolutely massive. Because the case exposed some major failings, it actually forced some real changes. Federal sex trafficking enforcement has been expanded. That secretive plea deal was so controversial that now there's way more scrutiny on those kinds of agreements. The crazy financial web Epstein used also pushed for stronger banking rules to spot dirty money. And this is a big one.
There's now a much bigger legal focus on holding not just people, but also the institutions that enable them accountable.
And all of this really leaves us with one final, very tough question that this whole saga forces us all to think about. When justice gets debated so publicly, how do we, as a society, balance that intense demand for total transparency with the absolute fundamental need to protect the privacy of victims? It's a tough balancing act, and there are no easy answers.